Tonight, we uncover the story of a creator too flawed, too dangerous for the church to recognize. A being known as the Demiurge, erased from scripture, hidden in myths, and whispered about in texts buried beneath stone and silence. His creation was imperfect, beautiful, yet flawed. A world that mirrored his own errors, a reflection humanity was never meant to fully see. Those who dared question the nature of this creator, who sought the knowledge suppressed by centuries of orthodoxy, found themselves labelled heretics, their discoveries hidden, their voices silenced. Hidden libraries, secret societies, and cryptic manuscripts preserved fragments of his story, encoded in symbols, diagrams, and allegories meant to survive a world that demanded perfection. Yet the traces remain, scattered across art, philosophy, and the echoes of human thought, waiting for those brave enough to follow the trail. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of history, into the silent chronicles of the flawed creator the church could not canonize. And as you watch, remember, this is more than a story. It is an invitation to question, to see beyond the perfection we are told to trust, and to confront the hidden truths of creation itself. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. The story begins in a time before the pages of history were neatly written, when the world was still young and the heavens watched silently. Long before the rise of empires, long before churches held the power to shape what humanity could know, there was a figure that dared to create, a being neither wholly divine nor entirely human. This was the Demiurge, a creator cast as flawed, a figure who shaped the material world, yet couldn't claim the perfection of the higher realms. History, as we know it, has quietly erased him, leaving only whispers in texts that survived the careful hands of those who decided what should be remembered and what should vanish. The Demiurge emerged in the earliest myths of civilizations that existed before the age of Rome, before the year 200, when cities and scholars flourished across lands now buried beneath time. Unlike the omnipotent creator of orthodox teachings, the Demiurge was limited, bound by his own imperfection, struggling to balance the beauty and chaos of the world he brought into being. He was a craftsman of matter, of stone and river, of sky and living flesh, yet always aware that something essential escaped his grasp. His world was full of wonders and failures side by side, a mirror of the Creator himself. Scholars who later wrote the canonical histories of humankind did not grant him a place among their saints or prophets. Manuscripts that spoke of him were either rewritten or destroyed, and the few that survived did so in secret, hidden in monastic vaults, in scripts written in Greek, Coptic, and early Latin. The Church, rising in power after the fall of Rome in 476, found no room for a creator who was not flawless, a being who challenged the notion of divine authority that would soon shape the lives of millions. Those who told his story were branded heretics, and their works quietly vanished. Yet traces remain, if you know where to look. The Demiurge appears in allegories, in the careful records of Gnostic sects, in the writings of thinkers who questioned the perfection of creation and the authority of those who claimed to speak for God. He is described as a master of matter, struggling against forces he could not fully understand, his creations both magnificent and flawed. He is a reminder that creation itself may not be as simple or as pure as the textbooks claim, that the material world carries the marks of imperfection, the echoes of a maker who was never meant to be canonized. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is why this story was hidden so deliberately, why humanity was told to forget. What did the Church fear about a flawed creator? Was it simply the challenge to its authority? Or did the truth of the Demiurge reveal something deeper about the nature of the world, about our place within it, about the very light and shadow that shape knowledge and belief? Tonight, as we peer into the shadows of history, we begin to uncover a story that was meant to be forgotten. The story of a creator whose imperfection tells us more about ourselves than we ever realized. The first breath of creation was neither quiet nor perfect. It was a spark, a pulse of energy, a moment when the Demiurge reached out into the void and shaped the first forms of the material world. Unlike the spiritual realm of pure light, which existed beyond comprehension, this world was tangible, flawed, and alive with possibility. Mountains rose jagged and uneven, rivers twisted through the land without guidance, and the sky itself shimmered with colors that could not be named. Every creation bore the mark of the Demiurge, a reflection of his ambition and his limits. In those earliest days, the Demiurge labored alone, shaping landscapes, oceans, forests, and the very air that would carry life. His hands were steady, yet never flawless. Trees grew with branches that bent strangely, birds sang in discordant patterns, and the first animals roamed in ways that both amazed and confounded their creator. Unlike the perfect forms of the celestial realms, this world was alive with imbalance. Yet that imbalance gave it character, depth, and a vitality that no perfection could create. The Demiurge's work was not without intention. Each mountain, each river, each creature was placed with purpose, yet constrained by the imperfection inherent in the act of creation. He observed his work with a mixture of pride and frustration, understanding that what he built would forever bear the marks of his limits. The earth was beautiful, but it was flawed. It was alive, but it was unpredictable. And it was within this unpredictability that the true spark of creation revealed itself. Humans came later, but even the first forms of life carried the seeds of imperfection and potential. Every creature, every plant, every stone reflected the tension between order and chaos. The Demiurge had created a world that could teach, challenge, and inspire. Unlike the spiritual realm, which existed in perfect harmony, this material plane was a classroom, a laboratory, and a mirror. Those who would come to inhabit it would struggle, learn, and adapt, discovering truths that even the Demiurge could not fully foresee. Yet, as creation spread, so did the shadow of limitation. The Demiurge watched as life grew and faltered, as rivers overflowed and skies darkened. His imperfections were everywhere, etched into the fabric of the world. And this is what would make his creation both real and alive. A perfect world would be static, lifeless, and unchanging. It would be a reflection of divine light, without contrast. But in the spark of flawed creation, there was movement, struggle, and the possibility of growth. Even now, the echoes of that first spark remain. The mountains, the forests, the rivers, and the creatures all carry the signature of the Demiurge. Every flaw is a story, every imperfection a lesson. The material world, with its beauty and chaos, continues to remind us that creation is not a simple act. It is an expression of will and limitation, a dance between light and shadow. And it was in that first spark that the Demiurge taught the most important lesson, that imperfection can give birth to wonder, and that a world shaped by hands that are neither divine nor flawless can still be extraordinary. The first humans emerged in the soft light of dawn, their forms fragile yet alive, with curiosity and instinct. The Demiurge watched them from a distance, a silent observer of his own creation, noting the ways they mirrored his imperfections. He had given them shape and breath, but like all of his works, they were not flawless. Their movements were clumsy, their instincts uneven, yet within that imperfection lay potential, a spark that could grow beyond the bounds he had set. He saw the way they stumbled over roots and rocks, the way their hands grasped at the air before learning to build. Every misstep was a reflection of his own limitations, a reminder that creation was never perfect, never entirely predictable. And yet, he also saw brilliance. A child discovering how to coax fire from stone, a pair of humans learning to cooperate to hunt and gather, a mind sparking with the beginnings of thought. Each success was tempered by error, yet it shone all the more because it had been hard won. The Demiurge understood that in giving humans the power to learn, to adapt, and to question, he was exposing his own weaknesses. They were mirrors of his own struggle, reflections of a creator who could imagine perfection, but could not impose it. When a human failed, he saw the echo of his own misjudgment, the imperfection that was unavoidable in a world of matter and form. And when they succeeded, he felt the faint thrill of hope, knowing that even within limitation, something remarkable could emerge. He noticed how humans began to look at the world, their eyes catching the curves of a river, the patterns of leaves, the movement of the sun across the sky. They did not simply observe, they questioned, they wondered. And in their wonder, the Demiurge saw a dangerous brilliance, a light that could illuminate both their own potential and the flaws of their creator. For the first time, he sensed that the humans might surpass him, not in power, but in understanding. And yet, with understanding came chaos. Humans began to test boundaries, to experiment, to make mistakes that rippled outward, shaping the land, altering ecosystems, and challenging the balance of creation itself. The Demiurge watched with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that these reflections of himself could one day become a force he could not control. The potential for greatness and the certainty of error existed together, inseparable, like shadow and light intertwined. The first humans were not perfect, and neither was their creator. The Demiurge understood that imperfection was not a flaw to erase, but a reality to embrace. Each mistake, each triumph, each flicker of thought carried within it a reflection of the creator's own struggle. And in those reflections, he saw the beginning of a story that would unfold across generations, a story of learning, growth, and the constant tension between brilliance and error. The humans moved through the world, leaving footprints that were both chaotic and beautiful, and the Demiurge observed, knowing that in their shadows he could see himself more clearly than ever before. As humans grew and wandered further from the rivers and forests of their beginnings, they began to ask questions that stirred the Demiurge. They did not simply gather food or build shelter. They looked at the stars, tracing their paths across the sky, and wondered why they moved as they did. They watched the changing seasons and asked why some crops failed while others flourished. They noticed patterns in the rivers, the mountains, the animals, and in themselves, and slowly began to question the very nature of the world around them. The Demiurge felt a strange unease. He had shaped a world of matter, imperfect but complete in his own view, yet now the humans were probing its edges, discovering gaps in his design, noticing flaws he had hoped would remain unnoticed. They began to ask what he could not answer fully. Why was the world uneven? Why did suffering exist? Why did the sun rise and fall with such relentless certainty, yet leave shadows behind? In their curiosity, they touched upon truths that were meant to be subtle, hints of knowledge that the Demiurge himself had struggled to understand. With each question, a ripple spread through the human mind. They shared their discoveries in whispers and gestures, in drawings on stone and markings, in the earth. They began to connect cause and effect, to see relationships between things that had once seemed separate and chaotic. And in doing so, they approached a dangerous understanding, one that threatened to reveal the limitations of their creator. The Demiurge had never intended for them to see the full extent of the divine hierarchy, the higher realms of pure light, or the perfection that existed beyond their flawed world. Fear began to settle over him. Not fear in the sense of weakness, but a deep awareness that knowledge could alter the balance of creation. Humans could awaken, and in awakening, they could challenge him. If they saw the imperfection in the world, if they recognized his own limits, they could question the authority that even higher beings had given him. The Demiurge realized that creation was no longer under his quiet control. The spark of inquiry in human minds was like a flame, growing with every observation, every experiment, every bold thought that reached beyond the physical plane. He watched as some humans discovered fire, as others experimented with early tools, and still others traced patterns in the night sky. Each discovery, each insight, brought them closer to understanding that the world might not be as it appeared. The Demiurge sensed the tension between ambition and limitation, and he knew that these humans were beginning to see beyond what he could dictate. Forbidden knowledge was spreading quietly among them, a dangerous awareness that could reshape their understanding of life, creation, and their place in the cosmos. And so the Demiurge observed with care, seeking ways to guide, to temper, and sometimes to restrain. He did not wish to destroy them, but he understood that the awakening of human thought could never be fully contained. In those early questions, those first acts of curiosity, the seeds of conflict with the higher order of creation were sown. The world had become alive with inquiry, and the Demiurge, despite his power, could feel the growing weight of human understanding pressing against the edges of his imperfect design. As the centuries passed, human societies grew more complex, and with that complexity came the need for order, rules, and stories that could unite people under a single understanding of the world. By the 1st and 2nd centuries, Christian institutions began to rise from the scattered communities of believers, spreading across lands once ruled by the vast Roman Empire. These early churches were more than places of worship. They became centers of learning, centers of authority, and centers of control, slowly shaping how humans would understand creation, divinity, and their place in the cosmos. The rise of the church brought with it a focus on codifying doctrine, deciding what was acceptable belief and what was not. Stories of alternative creator figures, such as the Demiurge, were increasingly viewed as dangerous. They challenged the narrative of a perfect, omnipotent God, and the authority of those speaking in his name. Texts that described flawed creation, that hinted at a material world imbued with imperfection, were labeled heretical. Clerics and scholars worked diligently to define orthodoxy, to create a framework where belief was controlled, and questions that threatened the official story were discouraged or punished. By the year 300, the Church had gained significant influence over the political and social structures of Europe. Bishops and councils met to determine the boundaries of acceptable thought, and texts that contained contradictory ideas were burned, rewritten, or hidden away. The stories of flawed creators, Gnostic teachings, and alternative cosmologies became whispers, passing secretly among small groups of adherents who risked persecution to preserve knowledge the Church had deemed dangerous. These early Christian institutions understood the power of controlling what people knew and what they could imagine. Knowledge was power, and limiting that knowledge ensured the Church could maintain spiritual and temporal authority. Monasteries became the safe places where texts were copied and preserved. But even there, the copying process was selective. Works that aligned with Church doctrine were reproduced, while those that diverged were either censored or ignored. The lives of humans, the nature of the cosmos, and the imperfections of the material world were reframed to fit the emerging narrative of a flawless creation under divine oversight. The Demiurge, once a figure studied and revered by secret sects, vanished from the public imagination. His story was replaced by a singular, omnipotent God whose perfection could not be questioned. Even as the Church spread its influence, there remained subtle echoes of forbidden knowledge. Hidden texts, coded symbols, and allegorical teachings preserved the memory of alternative creation myths, though their reach was limited. The Church, aware of these fragments, worked tirelessly to control, suppress, and reinterpret them. Scholars who dared explore these heresies risked being labelled dangerous, excommunicated, or worse. The Church had become both the keeper of faith and the gatekeeper of knowledge, shaping not just belief, but the boundaries of imagination itself. By the early 5th century, the pattern was clear. The Church did not merely teach faith. It defined what could be known, what could be imagined, and what could be remembered. Alternative creator figures like the Demiurge were erased from public consciousness, replaced by a narrative that placed the Church at the center of truth and history. In shaping doctrine, suppressing heretical texts, and controlling knowledge, the Church ensured that humans would come to see creation, and the cosmos only through the lens it provided, leaving only faint shadows of the Demiurge's story behind. In the centuries following the rise of Christian authority, the story of the Demiurge became a ghost in the libraries of the world. Manuscripts that spoke of a flawed creator, that described the material world as imperfect and separate from the realm of pure light, were carefully censored. Clerics and scribes worked in silent chambers, copying only what served the Church's narrative, rewriting passages to align with doctrine, and in some cases, consigning entire texts to fire. Knowledge that did not support orthodoxy was not merely ignored, it was erased. By the year 350, councils of bishops met across the lands, gathering to determine what was heretical and what was sacred. Any text that suggested humans could understand creation beyond what was revealed through Scripture was deemed dangerous. The Demiurge, once studied and acknowledged by secret sects, disappeared from the pages of public record. Apocryphal texts that survived the initial waves of censorship were hidden away in monastic vaults, locked behind doors that few could enter, their contents known only to a select few who understood the risk of possession. The Church's influence over literacy and manuscript production made it nearly impossible for heretical ideas to survive in circulation. Monks copied the Bible with meticulous care. but they left out or altered passages that contradicted official teachings. Gnostic writings, philosophical treatises, and other works that described alternative understandings of creation were either destroyed, rewritten, or kept in secrecy. Fires consumed countless scrolls, and libraries that once held the wisdom of older civilizations were reduced to shelves of sanctioned texts, leaving humanity with a version of history carefully curated by those in power. Some texts were rewritten entirely, replacing the Demiurge with the omnipotent god of orthodox belief. Stories of imperfect creation became moral lessons, allegories of human sin and divine justice. What once may have been philosophical debate or cosmological observation was transformed into doctrine, interpreted through the lens of salvation and obedience. In this way, the Church not only controlled what people read, but also how they thought, shaping entire generations to see the world as the creation of a perfect and unquestionable deity. Yet fragments survived, hidden in the shadows of monasteries, whispered among secret sects, or encoded in illustrations and marginalia. These remnants carried hints of the Demiurge's existence, symbols of a knowledge that had been deliberately suppressed. Scholars who stumbled upon them risked censure or accusation, yet even in hiding, these texts endured, a silent testament to a story the Church wished to forget. By the year 500, the erasure was nearly complete. The Demiurge existed only as a faint echo in forbidden texts, a figure quietly erased from the spiritual and intellectual memory of Europe. What remained was a world shaped by the Church's careful hand, a world where creation was flawless, divine authority absolute, and questioning perilous. Every erased manuscript, every burned scroll, every hidden apocryphal text strengthened the Church's control, ensuring that the imperfect creator would be remembered by almost or no one, and that humanity would be left to accept a world ordered by faith alone. In the hidden corners of the ancient world, away from the eyes of the rising Church, Gnostic sects quietly preserved the memory of the Demiurge. These groups did not worship him as a perfect god, but they recognized him as a creator, flawed and limited, whose work shaped the material world in ways that could never match the purity of the divine light above. Their teachings emphasized that the physical realm was imperfect, full of struggle, error, and impermanence, a mirror of the Creator who had fashioned it. By the year 200, these secret communities had developed a complex system of knowledge, passing their understanding through coded texts, symbols, and oral tradition. The Demiurge appeared in their teachings as a cautionary figure, a reminder that creation itself could be both beautiful and flawed, and that humans, in their own growth and discovery, were reflecting the imperfections of their maker. Unlike the Church, which demanded unquestioning obedience, the Gnostics encouraged insight, reflection, and a search for wisdom hidden beneath the surface of the world. Their texts were often written in cryptic language, layered with metaphors and symbols that obscured meaning from outsiders. Diagrams of celestial spheres, the shapes of stars, and the paths of planets were intertwined with lessons about creation, imperfection, and divine consciousness. Humans were taught to look beyond what they could see and feel, to recognize that the material world was a shadow of a higher reality. The Demiurge was not evil, but constrained by his own limitations, and those who understood his nature could begin to see the contrast between the flawed world and the perfection of the spiritual realm. Gnostic communities were small, their numbers scattered, and yet their influence was persistent. They preserved manuscripts in hidden locations, inscribed on papyrus, carved into stone, and later copied into vellum. These manuscripts contained stories, philosophical debates, and reflections on creation that never reached the mainstream. While the Church sought to erase any memory of alternative cosmologies, the Gnostics quietly maintained their whisper of truth, knowing that one day humanity might seek answers beyond the sanctioned teachings of the orthodox world. Even in persecution, the Gnostics endured. By the year 300, as the Church consolidated power across the Roman Empire, many of these sects were hunted, their writings confiscated, their teachers silenced. Yet, fragments survived, smuggled across regions, hidden in caves, and entrusted to initiates who would carry the knowledge forward. In these shadows, the story of the Demiurge persisted, a subtle but unbroken thread connecting generations of thinkers who refused to accept a world without questions. The whisper of the Demiurge teaches that imperfection is inherent in material creation, that humans inherit both error and brilliance from their maker, and that the search for understanding cannot be controlled by authority alone. It reminds us that there is a knowledge beyond what is allowed, a truth that survives in secrecy, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to listen to the quiet voice that has never been fully silenced. The Demiurge did not work alone. As he shaped the world, higher celestial beings observed him from realms of perfect light, beings whose existence was beyond human comprehension. These angels, emissaries of the divine, were not pleased with his methods. They criticized the imperfections in his creations, the mistakes that left animals and humans struggling, the uneven mountains, the rivers that overflowed, and the skies that sometimes burned with storms uncontrolled. Their voices were both guidance and judgment, a constant reminder that his work was being watched. By the year 300, these interactions had become a pattern. The angels imposed limits, suggesting corrections, guiding his hands, and in some moments reprimanding him for choices that led to imbalance. The Demiurge, though powerful, felt the pressure of their scrutiny. His creations were not perfect, and the higher beings demanded that he strive toward an impossible standard. In this tension between his will and theirs, the material world took shape, with both grandeur and flaw, a landscape marked by ambition, constrained by oversight. The lessons of these early conflicts echo through time, for the angel's authority over the Demiurge mirrors the way later institutions would control human thought. Just as the angels constrained a flawed creator, the Church would rise to constrain knowledge, interpretation, and belief. Those who strayed from sanctioned understanding were corrected, guided, or punished. The Demiurge's experience reveals a cosmic precedent for authority over creation and comprehension, a pattern repeated in centuries to come when the written word and sacred texts became tools of control. Humans, unaware of these celestial negotiations, moved through the imperfect world, shaped by the Demiurge's hands, but also by the invisible pressure of the higher beings. Crops sometimes failed, storms reshaped the land, and animals acted unpredictably. Every flaw carried a lesson for the Demiurge, every imperfection a reflection of limits imposed from above. It was a world where creativity and freedom existed only within boundaries, a world where authority demanded respect, compliance, and understanding of hierarchy. By the year 400, the Demiurge began to understand that his own power was both granted and restrained. He could build and shape, yet he could not erase the judgment of those higher than him. This awareness brought caution, even fear, into his work, Each human he shaped was subject to the consequences of his imperfection and the oversight of the angels. This dual influence created a world that was neither entirely free nor entirely guided, a delicate balance that required vigilance and restraint. The story of angels and authority reminds us that power is never absolute. Even a creator is subject to oversight, to critique, and to boundaries imposed from beyond. In the material world, humans inherited this structure, learning that freedom exists alongside limitation, that creation is influenced by forces both seen and unseen. The Demiurge's struggle with higher beings became a lesson for the ages, a blueprint of control, hierarchy, and the tension between ambition and restraint that would echo through history in ways humans would only later begin to recognize. The Demiurge looked upon his creation and felt both pride and unease. The world was alive, full of movement and color, yet it was imperfect in ways that frustrated him. Mountains rose too steep, rivers carved unexpected paths, and storms swept across the land with a force he had not intended. The first humans struggled to survive, learning the patterns of the world only through trial and error. The Demiurge wondered if he could correct these flaws, if he could impose perfection on a realm that had been shaped by his own limitations. By the year 300, he began to make adjustments, subtle at first, guiding the rivers, reshaping valleys, smoothing the terrain. Yet with each change, new imperfections emerged. Where he had corrected a flaw, another appeared elsewhere, a reminder that creation was a web of interconnection and unpredictability. He realized that the temptation to perfect his work was dangerous, for in trying to erase error, he risked destroying the balance and beauty that imperfection had given the world. The humans themselves became part of this struggle. Some learned quickly, adapting to the changes, finding ways to hunt, gather, and build despite the challenges around them. Others faltered, suffering from the unintended consequences of the Demiurge's adjustments. He observed their resilience and failure, with a mixture of admiration and frustration, understanding that their lives were shaped by the tension between the world he imagined and the world that existed. In every flaw, there was a lesson. In every success, a reflection of potential beyond his own control. The higher beings continued to watch, reminding him that perfection was not his to impose. The angels' critiques echoed through the skies, pressing him to accept the inherent limits of his power. The temptation to perfect creation was as much a trap as it was a desire. If he pursued it too strongly, he risked undermining the freedom of the beings he had created, the unpredictability that made the world alive. In this tension, the Demiurge discovered that flaw and beauty were inseparable, that ambition must coexist with limitation. Shaobul. The year 400, he had come to understand that true creation was not about perfection. It was about possibility, about the spark of life and thought that could grow beyond the Creator's design. Every storm, every crooked tree, every human misstep was a testament to the vitality of a world that was alive, imperfect, and capable of surprise. In embracing flaw, the Demiurge allowed the material realm to breathe, to evolve, and to reflect the complexity of existence itself. The story of the Demiurge and his temptation to perfect creation teaches that ambition alone cannot achieve true mastery. Flaw and error are not weaknesses to be erased, but elements that give life depth, challenge, and meaning. In the tension between aspiration and limitation, the world becomes richer, more vibrant, and more alive. Humans, animals, and landscapes all carry the marks of this delicate balance, living reflections of a creator who learned that imperfection is the essence of life itself. As humans moved across the lands shaped by the Demiurge, they became living reflections of their creator, embodying both brilliance and imperfection. Their hands built shelters from stone and wood, yet the structures were uneven, sometimes collapsing under their own weight. Their minds conceived ideas, stories, and patterns, but often misjudged the consequences of their actions. In every achievement and every mistake, the Demiurge saw a mirror of himself, a reflection of the tension between ambition and limitation that had defined the creation of the world itself. By the year 400, human communities had begun to organize, learning from experience, observing nature, and passing knowledge from one generation to the next. They noticed patterns in the stars, the seasons, and the growth of crops. They built rudimentary tools to hunt, to cook, and to protect themselves. Yet these accomplishments were never perfect. A fire might burn too hot, a shelter might fall in a storm, a calculation might fail. Every error was a lesson, every success a glimpse of possibility. And in both, the Demiurge saw his own hand in the fabric of human existence. The connection between creator and creation deepened as humans began to reflect on themselves. They looked in mirrors, in pools of water, and in the faces of one another, recognizing both beauty and flaw. They questioned why suffering existed, why some were stronger or smarter, why life could be so unpredictable. These questions were not just human curiosity. They were echoes of the Demiurge's own struggle, the awareness that imperfection existed in every layer of the world. In watching humans struggle and thrive, he saw a pattern repeated, a living lesson about the balance of power, knowledge, and limitation. By the year 500, humans were beginning to experiment with ideas that went beyond mere survival. They created art, painted stories on cave walls, and developed symbols to record history and knowledge. Their creations carried both skill and error, precision and chaos. The Demiurge understood that in reflecting his imperfections, humans also reflected his creativity. Each innovation was a conversation between the limitations of matter and the spark of intelligence he had placed within them. They were his mirrors, showing him the consequences of his choices, the ripple of his flaws, and the unexpected brilliance that could emerge from constraint. The story of humans as mirrors of the Demiurge teaches that creation is never one-sided. A world shaped by imperfection produces beings who embody both failure and triumph, who inherit the constraints of their maker, but also rise above them. The interplay between creator and creation becomes a dynamic, ongoing process, a reflection that is never static, always evolving. Humans carry within them the echoes of their flawed maker, yet they are more than copies. They are living evidence that from imperfection, brilliance can emerge, and that life itself is a reflection of both error and wonder intertwined. By the year 400, the Church had grown into a force that extended across continents, shaping thought, belief, and the very understanding of creation. Teachings about the Demiurge, once whispered in secret or preserved in hidden manuscripts, became a target of systematic suppression. The Church labeled these ideas heretical, dangerous to faith, and subversive to the authority it sought to establish. Possessing texts that described a flawed creator or an imperfect world became a risk that few were willing to take. Monks and scholars who encountered these manuscripts faced difficult choices. Some destroyed them, believing that obedience to the church outweighed the preservation of knowledge. Others hid them in secret compartments, in the walls of monasteries, or buried deep beneath the earth, hoping that one day their words might survive without bringing peril. The church codified rules that made heresy a crime against not just God, but society itself, ensuring that alternative ideas about creation would be silenced or forgotten. By the year 500, councils convened to determine the boundaries of faith, drawing clear lines between orthodoxy and forbidden knowledge. Texts that explored the Demiurge's existence, that suggested imperfection in the material world, or that proposed alternative cosmologies were banned. Priests and bishops enforced these decrees with careful precision. A book could be burned, a scroll erased, or a scholar punished simply for questioning the accepted narrative. Even slight deviations from the sanctioned story of creation were dangerous, and those who spoke openly about forbidden ideas risked excommunication, imprisonment, or worse. The Church did more than punish. It rewrote, reinterpreted, and redirected attention. Stories of the Demiurge were transformed into allegories of sin, temptation, and error. What had once been philosophical reflection became moral warning. Human curiosity was framed as dangerous, questioning as a path toward damnation. In this way, the Church not only controlled the flow of knowledge, but also shaped how people perceived the world and their place within it. What was once a nuanced exploration of creation became a lesson in obedience, a carefully structured hierarchy of belief that left little room for independent thought. Despite this, fragments of the Demiurge's teachings endured. Hidden texts passed quietly from generation to generation. Symbols in manuscripts, diagrams of celestial spheres, and coded messages carried the remnants of knowledge the Church sought to erase. Secret societies and initiates became the keepers of these whispers, understanding that the truth of a flawed creation couldn't survive in the open. They preserved it in silence, knowing that to reveal it openly could mean death or exile. The story of codified heresy demonstrates the Church's power not only to dictate belief, but to control memory itself. By declaring the Demiurge heretical, the Church erased an entire perspective on creation, shaping centuries of thought and perception. Humans were taught to see the world as flawless, their questions confined within the boundaries set by authority. The consequences of possession or study of forbidden texts created an environment where silence became survival, and curiosity was the first step toward danger. In this control, the Demiurge's story became a shadow, known only to those brave enough to seek the truth beyond the sanctioned narrative. Deep within the walls of monasteries, behind heavy oak doors and hidden chambers, lay secret libraries that few were allowed to see. These vaults preserved fragments of knowledge long deemed dangerous, texts that spoke of the Demiurge and the imperfect nature of creation. The manuscripts were encoded in symbols, diagrams, and allegories, their meanings carefully veiled, so that only the initiated could understand. By the year 500, these hidden collections had become sanctuaries for knowledge the Church publicly refused to acknowledge. Monks and scholars who guarded these libraries understood the importance of secrecy. They knew that a single misplaced scroll could provoke suspicion or punishment. By day they copied sanctioned texts, the Bible and other Orthodox works, while by night they studied cryptic writings that hinted at an alternative history of creation. In these secret spaces, The whispers of the Demiurge survived, encoded in complex illustrations of celestial spheres, geometric patterns, and allegorical figures that spoke of imperfection, choice, and the tension between creator and creation. The libraries were not only repositories of text, but also of memory. Manuscripts were catalogued in codes that disguised their true contents. Diagrams were layered with symbolism that could mislead anyone unfamiliar with the tradition, and allegories masked philosophical debates about the material world. The keepers of this knowledge understood that survival depended on careful concealment. Their work was not just scholarship. It was preservation against the tide of erasure that swept across Europe as the Church codified doctrine and suppressed heretical ideas. By the year 600, these secret libraries had become networks. Some were hidden beneath the floors of monasteries, others in remote caves or within private chambers of wealthy patrons sympathetic to the cause. The knowledge of the Demiurge travelled silently, passed hand to hand, copied in secrecy, and stored for future generations. It was a delicate balance between risk and preservation, for discovery could mean excommunication, imprisonment, or even death. Yet the keepers of these texts believed that some truths were too important to vanish completely. These hidden archives contained more than philosophical writings. They held diagrams showing the imperfections of the material world, coded illustrations of celestial hierarchies, and allegories that taught humans to perceive beyond surface appearances. They captured the duality of creation, the interplay between brilliance and error, and the lessons embedded in imperfection. Even as the Church enforced orthodoxy above ground, these subterranean vaults nurtured a quiet rebellion of thought, a continuity of knowledge that refused to be extinguished. The story of the secret libraries reminds us that history is rarely as complete as it appears. While public texts were censored and burned, hidden spaces preserved the fragments of forbidden wisdom. The Demiurge, erased from scripture, survived in these secret corners, encoded in symbols meant to guide those who could see beyond the imposed narrative. And it is in these vaults, quietly preserved across centuries, that the shadow of an alternative creation waited for the curious, the brave, and the persistent to discover it. By the year 600, the Church had refined a system to control knowledge that reached far beyond sermons and scripture. Monastic orders were no longer just caretakers of faith. They had become the architects of silence, tasked with removing or reinterpreting texts that did not align with sanctioned doctrine. Manuscripts that contained whispers of the Demiurge, or hinted at imperfection in creation, were meticulously censored, rewritten, or hidden from view. The goal was not only to preserve the narrative of divine perfection, but to ensure that no one could question it. Monks worked with painstaking care. Every word, every illustration, every diagram was examined for potential heresy. Passages suggesting that humans could comprehend creation beyond what was revealed through the Bible were erased. Stories that portrayed the Demiurge as a flawed creator were recast as allegory or omitted entirely. This process was subtle. Texts were not always destroyed. Many were carefully altered, giving the appearance of continuity while stripping away any content that challenged orthodoxy. The Church understood that controlling perception was more powerful than outright destruction. By the year 800, inquisitors joined the effort, moving through regions to enforce the boundaries set by the monastic scholars. Their presence ensured compliance and instilled fear. Possession of prohibited texts could result in interrogation, imprisonment, or even execution. Families were questioned, libraries searched, and hidden vaults discovered. The inquisitors were methodical, following the blueprints laid down by generations of monks who had perfected the art of silencing ideas. Knowledge was a weapon, and controlling it meant controlling belief itself. The reinterpretation of texts became an industry. Ancient manuscripts were rewritten in Latin to align with doctrine. Diagrams were annotated to reflect theological correctness, and allegories were inserted to emphasize moral lessons rather than philosophical inquiry. The Demiurge, once studied as a creator with limitations, became a cautionary figure, a symbol of what happens when humans stray from the path of obedience. Every alteration reinforced the authority of the Church, embedding the sanctioned worldview into generations of scholars, students, and lay people. Even as the architects of silence worked, fragments of forbidden knowledge survived, carefully concealed in marginalia, cryptic diagrams, and obscure allegories. These hints were enough to allow secret societies, mystics, and determined scholars to preserve the memory of alternative creation myths. Yet, for the majority, the world became one of unquestioned authority. Humans were taught to accept perfection as divine, to see creation as flawless, and to fear inquiry beyond what was permitted. The Demiurge became invisible, a ghost whose story endured only in the shadows. The work of the monastic orders and inquisitors demonstrates the power of silence as a tool of control. By removing, rewriting, and interpreting texts, the Church shaped history and knowledge itself. Humans learned not only what to believe, but also what questions were too dangerous to ask. The architects of silence did not merely protect doctrine. They built the framework that defined perception for centuries, ensuring that the story of creation and the flawed creator would be known to almost no one, and remembered by only those brave enough to seek it in hidden corners of the world. As the centuries passed, human hands shaped cathedrals, temples, and sacred architecture that towered across the lands. To the casual observer, these buildings were monuments to faith and devotion. Yet, hidden within their stones, columns, and arches were subtle clues about the Demiurge, carefully encoded by those who remembered his story. By the year 1100, master builders and architects had begun weaving symbols, patterns, and geometries into the structures, hiding knowledge in plain sight, unnoticed by the masses who walked beneath their vaulted ceilings. The shapes carved into stone were never arbitrary. Spirals, circles, and intersecting lines represented celestial patterns, the imperfection of the material world, and the tension between creation and divine light. Windows allowed light to fall in precise angles, illuminating symbols at specific times of the year, a silent message to those who could read it. These architectural features were a way of preserving fragments of knowledge, a language of stone that survived even as books were censored, burned, or hidden away. By the year 1200, these symbols had become a network, connecting cathedrals and sacred spaces across regions. Initiates who understood the hidden language could trace a path of learning, discovering truths about the flawed creator that the Church publicly denied. The Demiurge, erased from scripture, lived on in the silent testimony of masonry, geometry, and design. Each building was a coded manuscript, every pattern a hint, and every hidden symbol a whisper of forbidden knowledge. The masses who entered these spaces remained largely unaware. They saw only beauty, devotion, and divine inspiration, their eyes drawn to the grandeur and splendor of the sacred spaces. They did not notice the subtle anomalies, the intentional asymmetries, the patterns that reflected imperfection rather than heavenly perfection. Yet those anomalies carried meaning, a message that creation was not flawless, that human experience was shaped by both brilliance and error, and that the Demiurge's story endured beneath layers of stone and faith. Builders and artisans understood the risk. They were often part of guilds or secret societies that preserved this knowledge through initiation and training. Passing on the meaning of these symbols was dangerous, for the Church could still enforce orthodoxy and punish deviation. Yet they continued, embedding knowledge into the architecture itself, trusting that stone could outlast fire, censorship, and the passage of time. In this way, the truth of creation, the imperfect hand of the Demiurge, and the complexity of the material world could survive without being openly spoken or written. The story of symbols in stone teaches that knowledge can endure in forms beyond books and manuscripts. Architecture became a silent teacher, a guardian of forgotten truths. Humans who walked through these sacred spaces unknowingly witnessed the memory of a flawed creator, a reflection of imperfection hidden within grandeur, a history encoded in shapes, light, and structure. Even as centuries passed and orthodoxy prevailed, the Demiurge left his mark, waiting for those with eyes to see beyond the obvious, to read the world as a mirror of creation itself. In quiet corners of monasteries and private collections, ancient prophecies began to resurface, texts that had been overlooked, hidden, or deliberately ignored for centuries. These writings described a flawed creation, a world shaped by a creator who was not perfect, whose hands left error alongside beauty. By the year 1300, scholars and secret keepers began noticing these marginal texts, fragments of predictions and warnings tucked into the edges of manuscripts, often in coded language or allegorical form. The prophecies were not grand declarations, but subtle observations of the world's imperfection. They spoke of humans struggling, of natural disasters that mirrored the errors of their maker, and of a cosmos that contained both brilliance and flaw. Those who read them understood the implications immediately. If these texts were acknowledged, the authority of the Church, which insisted on divine perfection and absolute orthodoxy, could be questioned. The Demiurge, once erased from Scripture, was quietly revealing his presence again, challenging centuries of doctrinal control. By the year 1400, whispers of these prophecies had spread among learned circles and secret societies. They were cautious, aware of the dangers of discovery. Possession of such texts could lead to accusation, trial, or worse. Scholars who studied them in private began to see patterns, connecting the flaws described in the prophecies to the tangible imperfections of the world, from uneven landscapes to the unpredictability of human behavior. Each prophecy hinted at a creator who was constrained, limited, and imperfect, offering an alternative understanding of the cosmos that defied official teachings. The Church, however, remained vigilant. Inquisitors and monastic scholars monitored emerging scholarship, ensuring that any dangerous ideas were quickly reinterpreted or suppressed. Marginal texts were annotated to emphasize moral lessons or allegory, transforming warnings of flawed creation into lessons on sin, obedience, and divine justice. Even as the prophecies survived, their true meaning was obscured, disguised as harmless commentary or spiritual metaphor. The Demiurge's story remained hidden, accessible only to those willing to decipher the coded language of the margins. Yet, despite suppression, the prophecies persisted. They travelled in secret, copied by hand, hidden in bindings, and passed down through generations of initiates who understood their significance. They contained knowledge that the Church couldn't fully erase, glimpses of a world created not perfectly, but with error and unpredictability. In these writings, the material realm was acknowledged as a reflection of both brilliance and limitation, a mirror of the Creator's own imperfections. The story of the lost prophecies teaches that truth has a way of resurfacing, even when authority seeks to bury it. Hidden in the margins, in coded symbols and allegories, knowledge survived centuries of suppression. These texts threatened the Church not through open rebellion, but by quietly reminding those who could read them that the world was not flawless, that the Demiurge existed, and that understanding the cosmos required more than obedience. In the shadows of history, prophecies waited for the eyes capable of seeing beyond the surface, hinting that even suppressed knowledge could endure and challenge the narratives of power. The world the Demiurge shaped was not perfect. By the year 1500, humans had begun to notice the unevenness of the land, the unpredictability of weather, and the strange anomalies in the heavens. Storms could rise suddenly, rivers could flood with little warning, and earthquakes shook cities with no apparent reason. Celestial bodies sometimes moved in ways that puzzled early astronomers, and eclipses occurred without aligning with the understanding of the time. These events were the visible imprint of the Demiurge's imperfection, a cosmos that bore the marks of a flawed creator. Humans struggled to interpret these phenomena. Some saw them as divine punishment, others as the work of spirits, and a few as natural events governed by rules yet to be discovered. The Demiurge, watching from his place in the realm of material creation, felt the tension of his own limitations. Each disaster, each cosmic irregularity reminded him that the world he had crafted couldn't match the pure, unblemished light of the spiritual realm. Yet, from these imperfections arose human resilience and ingenuity, as people learned to build safer homes, predict seasonal changes, and chart the skies with growing precision. By the year 1600, chroniclers recorded floods, famines, and celestial anomalies in their texts, often attributing them to divine wrath or fate. These interpretations, however, obscured the deeper truth. The fractures in the cosmos were not moral lessons alone, but reflections of a creator struggling with his own limitations. Mountains formed too sharply, rivers carved unexpected paths, and storms reshaped landscapes in ways the Demiurge had not intended. Humanity experienced suffering not because the world was evil, but because it was inherently imperfect, a mirror of the flaws in its maker. Even beyond Earth, the skies carried signs of imperfection. Comets appeared unexpectedly, planets shifted slightly from anticipated paths, and stars burned with varying intensity. Observers recorded these anomalies, often in secret, trying to understand the rules behind the apparent chaos. The Demiurge's hand was visible in every irregularity, a reminder that creation was a balance between order and error. Humans began to recognize patterns within the chaos, yet always confronted the limits imposed by an imperfect world. The story of a fractured cosmos teaches that imperfection is not just human or material, but woven into the very fabric of existence. Suffering, unpredictability, and anomaly are not evidence of a careless or malicious world, but of a creation shaped by a being who is powerful, yet constrained. In understanding the fractures, humans also saw their own place in the universe, learning to navigate, adapt, and survive. The Demiurge's imperfection became a teacher, a constant reminder that life is complex, fragile, and filled with both wonder and challenge. The cosmos is a reflection of its maker, and by observing its flaws, humanity glimpses both the limits of creation and the potential for resilience that arises within it. In the shadows of history, secret societies, alchemists, and mystics quietly preserved knowledge of the Demiurge, safeguarding truths that the Church sought to suppress. By the year 1600, these groups had become the hidden counterbalance to orthodoxy, passing information in coded manuscripts, encrypted diagrams, and allegorical writings that only the initiated could understand. They recognized that the world had been shaped by a flawed creator, and that the imperfections of the material realm were not mistakes to be ignored, but lessons to be studied and understood. These groups worked carefully, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment, exile, or death. Alchemists experimented with the elements, decoding the patterns of matter and energy, often linking their discoveries to the cosmic errors left by the Demiurge. Mystics interpreted visions and dreams, connecting celestial anomalies with human behavior, tracing the fingerprints of imperfection in everything from the stars to the smallest details of daily life. Secret societies maintained libraries hidden in vaults, caves, and private chambers, ensuring that knowledge survived even when public records were censored or destroyed. By the year 1700, this counterbalance had developed a network that spanned regions. Manuscripts moved silently from hand to hand, copied carefully to preserve both content and secrecy. Symbols embedded in texts acted as keys, diagrams served as maps, and allegories disguised deep insights about creation. Members of these societies understood the tension between the Church's authority and the truths they preserved, knowing that one day, when the world was ready, the knowledge could emerge to challenge centuries of controlled thought. The teachings emphasized the duality of the material and spiritual worlds. Humans were encouraged to see that imperfection was inherent in creation, and that the Demiurge's flaws were mirrored in every corner of existence. By studying these patterns, they could gain insight into the balance between order and error, the interplay of ambition and limitation, and the ways that human ingenuity could flourish even within constraints. These lessons were never written plainly. They required interpretation, patience, and careful observation. The hidden counterbalance was also a means of survival. While the Church burned texts and labeled heresy, these groups created redundancy. Copies were hidden in multiple locations. Knowledge was divided into fragments, and every generation received only what could be safely preserved. Initiates were trained to read between the lines, to notice subtle deviations in architecture, manuscripts, and ritual. They became guardians of a truth that could not exist openly, maintaining the legacy of the Demiurge in the face of centuries of suppression. The story of the hidden counterbalance reminds us that knowledge has always found a way to endure. Even when power seeks to erase, restrict, or rewrite, there are those who preserve memory in silence, who pass on wisdom in coded form, and who ensure that the story of creation and imperfection remains alive. The Demiurge survived not in public texts or grand monuments alone, but in the quiet vigilance of those who understood that some truths are too important to vanish, waiting patiently for the world to be ready to see them again. By the year 1700, scholars, mystics, and rebels began to see the subtle fingerprints of the Demiurge in human thought, art, and innovation. They noticed that creativity was never flawless, that even the most brilliant inventions carried echoes of error alongside genius. Paintings contained asymmetries. Architectural marvels revealed imperfections in design, and philosophical writings wrestled with contradictions that reflected the imperfect material world. These observers realized that humans were mirrors of the Demiurge, embodying both brilliance and limitation in ways that revealed the connection between creator and creation. Artists in Italy and France studied human form and nature, capturing beauty that was never perfectly symmetrical, colors that varied with light, and lines that suggested motion and imperfection. Scholars began noticing patterns that seemed to echo the coded knowledge preserved in secret libraries, the hidden symbols in architecture, and the allegorical teachings passed down by mystics. Human creativity was shaped by necessity, limitation, and curiosity, reflecting a world crafted by a flawed hand and a mind that understood both potential and constraint. Inventors and thinkers experimented with ideas that often failed, yet these failures became lessons. By the year 1800, the scientific method was beginning to take shape in Europe, guided by observation, experimentation, and the recognition that nature was not perfect, and neither were humans who sought to understand it. Scholars realized that the Demiurge's imperfections were not only visible in physical forms, but also in the way humans approach knowledge. Every miscalculation, every unexpected result mirrored the tension inherent in creation itself. Mystics observed the human mind and spirit, noting the struggle between aspiration and limitation, between ambition and fallibility. They recognized that humans carried the Demiurge's imprint not just in error, but in insight, intuition, and innovation. By embracing flaw, humans could see the deeper patterns of the universe, understanding that imperfection was not a barrier, but a guide. Art, science, and philosophy became reflections of this principle, showing that progress arose from interaction with a world that was both brilliant and imperfect. Rebels and thinkers who questioned authority began connecting these observations with suppressed texts and hidden knowledge. They noticed parallels between the coded teachings of secret societies and the creative acts of humans across generations. Human thought and artistic expression were not random, but followed patterns influenced by the material world's inherent limitations. In recognizing this, scholars and mystics began to map a hidden history of influence, seeing the Demiurge as both a cautionary figure and a source of inspiration for understanding human potential. The mirror of humanity teaches that imperfection is integral to creativity. Humans reflect their flawed creator in every endeavor, yet, in doing so, they transcend the limitations imposed by error. Art, science, and innovation become living proof that imperfection can inspire, guide, and shape discovery. The Demiurge's influence is visible not in divine perfection, but in the interplay of success and failure, brilliance and mistake, revealing a connection between creator and creation that continues to shape the human story, waiting for those willing to look closely and see beyond the surface. By the year 1800, the Church had refined its ability to shape belief, not just through sermons and scripture, but by rewriting the narrative of creation itself. Stories that once acknowledged the imperfections of the Demiurge were transformed to emphasize divine perfection. Miracles were attributed solely to God. Knowledge was framed as the result of heavenly wisdom, and the flawed hand of the Demiurge was erased from history. The world was presented as orderly, purposeful, and flawless, hiding the truth of the material realm and the imperfect creator who had shaped it. Scholars who studied early texts noticed discrepancies, contradictions that hinted at a different story. Manuscripts that described the Demiurge's errors were reinterpreted, edited, or rewritten to align with church doctrine. Allegories became moral lessons. Diagrams of cosmic irregularities were annotated to show divine guidance, and even historical accounts of human achievement were reframed as gifts from God. By controlling the narrative, the Church ensured that creation appeared perfect, that miracles seemed supernatural rather than the consequence of imperfection, and that humans believed their world reflected divine order rather than flawed design. By the year 1850, printing presses had spread these rewritten narratives widely. Textbooks, sermons, and religious illustrations reinforced the idea that God's hand was flawless and that the material world was created in perfect harmony. Knowledge of the Demiurge survived only in hidden texts, secret societies, and obscure manuscripts. Any attempt to suggest a flawed creator was labeled heresy, suppressed, or ignored. The Church had succeeded not only in shaping belief, but in controlling perception of history, ensuring that generations grew up with a view of the world that left little room for doubt or independent inquiry. Artists, philosophers, and scientists who sought to explore the natural world were encouraged to see divine perfection in every pattern, from the symmetry of flowers to the order of the heavens. Mistakes and anomalies were often interpreted as tests, lessons, or hidden aspects of God's plan. The Demiurge, whose influence was evident in imperfection and error, was effectively erased from collective memory. Humanity was taught to revere perfection, to see divine order where the material world bore subtle flaws, and to attribute insight, innovation, and unexpected brilliance solely to God, rather than to a complex interplay of creation and imperfection. The process of rewriting the Creator demonstrates the Church's ability to control thought, not through destruction alone, but through reinterpretation. By reshaping narratives, they erased a flawed but instructive perspective, presenting a single version of reality that reinforced obedience and faith. The world became a stage for divine perfection, and the human role was to observe, follow, and believe. Yet in hidden corners, fragments of the Demiurge's story persisted, waiting for those willing to question, to read between the lines, and to see the subtle evidence of imperfection that the Church had labored to conceal. These fragments remind us that history is not only what is written, but also what is hidden, rewritten, and preserved in silence. By the year 1900, the story of the Demiurge had been pushed further into the shadows, eclipsed by centuries of orthodox theology. Attempts to reconcile the flawed creator with church doctrine failed repeatedly. Scholars and theologians who tried to integrate the Demiurge into a framework of divine perfection faced resistance, censorship, and ridicule. Texts that had survived centuries of concealment were buried deeper, hidden in private archives or coded manuscripts, their meanings obscured by layers of allegory. The truth of a flawed creation became almost impossible to discern, eclipsed by a narrative that demanded absolute obedience and unwavering belief. The myths of the Demiurge were transformed into allegories, moral tales that emphasized human imperfection rather than the imperfection of creation itself. Stories that once illustrated the tension between the material and spiritual realms became cautionary lessons, teaching humility, obedience, and the consequences of questioning divine authority. By framing the Demiurge as symbolic rather than real, the Church preserved control over human thought. Knowledge of the flawed creator existed only in whispers, in hidden texts, or in the minds of those who dared to study forbidden manuscripts. By the year 1950, archives and private collections held countless documents describing creation's imperfection, yet access was strictly limited. Scholars could request permission to view texts, but copying, photographing, or sharing information was forbidden. The deeper one delved into the history of the Demiurge, the more one realized how carefully knowledge had been hidden. Marginal notes, cryptic diagrams, and allegorical illustrations preserved fragments of truth. Yet, understanding them required context, skill, and courage. Each discovery was a reminder that centuries of suppression had transformed knowledge into a dangerous treasure. Even as the world modernized, the influence of the Demiurge remained, though invisible to most. Artists, writers, and independent thinkers occasionally stumbled upon the ideas embedded in allegories, influencing works of literature, painting, and architecture without fully understanding the source. Secret societies and mystics continued to study these fragments, passing them down cautiously. They understood that the Church had not destroyed knowledge entirely. Instead, it had obscured it, ensuring that truth could survive only in coded forms, understood by few and invisible to the majority. The eclipse of truth demonstrates the power of narrative and secrecy. By turning the Demiurge into allegory, burying texts, and restricting access, the Church effectively erased an alternative understanding of creation from public consciousness. Humanity was taught to see divine perfection everywhere, even as subtle flaws in the world whispered a different story. The Demiurge, flawed and hidden, became a symbol of what authority could suppress when knowledge threatened control. In the quiet spaces of hidden archives, in the coded language of symbols and allegories, the imperfect creator waited for those brave enough to recognize him. A reminder that even eclipsed, the truth endures and challenges those willing to seek beyond the light of sanctioned belief. By the year 1500, a subtle glimmer of forgotten knowledge began to resurface across Europe. Artists, scientists, and philosophers were awakening to ideas long suppressed, fragments of understanding about the Demiurge and the imperfect nature of creation that had been hidden for centuries. This was a time when curiosity and human ambition began to challenge centuries of control, when minds hungry for discovery glimpsed truths encoded in secret texts, allegories, and symbols that had survived in silence. The Renaissance was not only an era of rediscovery of classical knowledge, but also a quiet revelation of what had been deliberately concealed. Painters in Florence and Venice began experimenting with perspective, light, and human anatomy in ways that seemed extraordinary for the time. Sculptors like Michelangelo studied the human form with unprecedented precision, capturing both strength and vulnerability, beauty and imperfection. Scholars who examined ancient manuscripts found diagrams and notes that suggested knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that had been hidden or reinterpreted by the Church. These discoveries hinted at the Demiurge's influence, showing that creation was neither flawless nor fully understood, and that human ingenuity could engage with imperfection to achieve brilliance. By the year 1600, Renaissance thinkers were connecting threads of knowledge across disciplines. Architects studied ancient structures and encoded symbols, uncovering patterns that revealed an understanding of proportion, geometry, and natural law that predated public acknowledgement. Alchemists and early scientists revisited manuscripts, learning to experiment with natural processes, observing errors, anomalies, and imperfections as lessons rather than obstacles. In every experiment, in every brushstroke, there was a reflection of the Demiurge's flawed creation and the human ability to learn from it, to interpret it, and to transform it into insight. Even as the Church remained vigilant, attempting to maintain orthodoxy, some texts and ideas slipped into circulation. Patrons of art and science, scholars in universities, and members of secret societies preserved knowledge carefully, passing it to those deemed capable of understanding it without provoking censure. The Demiurge's presence, erased from official texts, now echoed in the flourishing of ideas that questioned absolute perfection, encouraging observation, inquiry, and reflection on the material world's inherent limitations. The Renaissance glimmer demonstrates that knowledge cannot be fully extinguished. Fragments of truth survived centuries of concealment, waiting for a time when human curiosity could rekindle their light. Artists, scientists, and philosophers became conduits for that knowledge, allowing glimpses of the imperfect creator to inspire human creativity and innovation. The flaws, the errors, the subtle irregularities in the world became a canvas for discovery. The Demiurge, once hidden, influenced a renewed understanding of creation, showing that even within centuries of suppression, ideas can endure, inspire, and illuminate the path for those willing to see beyond imposed narratives, finding wisdom in imperfection and brilliance in the overlooked. By the year 1800, the traces of the Demiurge that had survived centuries of suppression began to attract attention from a new generation of scholars, historians, and curious minds. As printing presses spread knowledge and the study of ancient texts became more accessible, hints of the flawed creator appeared in old manuscripts, marginal notes, and coded diagrams. Yet, these discoveries were often dismissed as speculation, misinterpretation, or even heresy. The Church, though less overtly controlling than in previous centuries, still influenced which narratives were accepted and which were marginalized. Throughout the 19th century, academics stumbled upon fragments of apocryphal texts describing creation as imperfect. Some were found in hidden libraries, tucked away in private collections, or preserved by secret societies that had maintained the knowledge for centuries. These texts suggested a creator who made errors, left imperfections in the material world, and whose influence was mirrored in human thought and behavior. Scholars who tried to present these findings publicly were met with skepticism, labeled as eccentric, and in some cases, their work was ignored entirely. By the year 1900, conspiracists and independent researchers began connecting these fragments to anomalies in art, architecture, and scientific discoveries. They noticed patterns that mirrored descriptions of the Demiurge, finding imperfection embedded in masterpieces, structural designs, and even early technological innovations. These modern observers began questioning the official narratives of history, wondering whether the accounts taught in schools had deliberately omitted uncomfortable truths. Every overlooked symbol, every unusual pattern in historical records became a clue, pointing toward a hidden story of creation. As the 20th century progressed, access to archives and international scholarship allowed deeper investigation. Scholars working in European and Middle Eastern libraries uncovered manuscripts that had been censored, rewritten, or misinterpreted by church authorities. They found references to a flawed creator, to a world shaped by error as well as order, and to human achievements influenced by this imperfect foundation. Yet mainstream academia often dismissed these findings as curiosities, speculative interpretations, or minor anomalies. The Demiurge remained invisible to the general public, obscured by centuries of selective memory and sanctioned history. By the year 2000, digital technology allowed researchers to examine texts and artifacts in ways previously impossible. High-resolution scans, comparative databases, and networked scholarship revealed connections that had been hidden in plain sight. Patterns in medieval manuscripts, symbolic motifs in architecture, and discrepancies in historical accounts all hinted at the Demiurge's subtle influence. Conspiracists used these findings to suggest that a shadow history had been suppressed, a version of creation that conflicted with the narrative of divine perfection. Though dismissed by many, the evidence sparked renewed debate and curiosity. The story of modern shadows demonstrates that knowledge suppressed for centuries can resurface in unexpected ways. Scholars, conspiracists, and independent researchers who look carefully can uncover fragments of the Demiurge, traces of imperfection, and hidden history that challenge established narratives. Even when dismissed, these shadows of truth persist, reminding us that the past is never fully controlled, and that curiosity can reveal hidden layers of reality, waiting for those willing to question, investigate, and see beyond the accepted version of creation and history. Deep within the stone walls of Vatican and monastic archives lies a world few have ever glimpsed. By the year 1800, scholars knew that these collections held more than religious texts. Maps, diagrams, and manuscripts quietly preserved knowledge that had been deemed too dangerous or heretical for public view. Among these hidden works were references to the Demiurge, the flawed creator erased from orthodox history, whose imperfections had shaped the material world in ways the Church preferred to obscure. These archives were silent witnesses to a history that had been selectively hidden, a collection of evidence that suggested a far more complex creation than official doctrine acknowledged. The manuscripts themselves were extraordinary. Some were written in languages no longer fully understood, blending Latin with Greek, Coptic, and symbolic codes designed to protect knowledge from prying eyes. Others contained diagrams of the cosmos, of the human body, and of natural phenomena, all annotated with observations that suggested a creator whose influence was imperfect and irregular. The texts did not simply record events. They offered interpretations of the material world, mapping errors and anomalies, showing patterns of imperfection that echoed the Demiurge's hand. Scholars who stumbled upon these works realized that they were holding the remnants of a suppressed understanding of creation. Maps hidden in the archives revealed knowledge of geography and astronomy that contradicted accepted timelines. Coastlines, star charts, and natural features were depicted with a precision that suggested access to sources older than the Renaissance, hints of civilizations and knowledge long erased from textbooks. These maps were not merely practical tools, but evidence that the Demiurge's influence had been recorded, studied, and preserved by those who understood the consequences of revealing too much. Their existence hinted at a continuity of knowledge that had survived centuries of suppression and manipulation. By the year 1900, access to these archives was tightly controlled. Only a select number of scholars could request entry, often limited to short periods of study under strict supervision. Copies were rarely allowed, and photographing or reproducing materials was forbidden. This secrecy ensured that the story of the Demiurge remained obscured, known only to those willing to risk scrutiny or censure. Even the most diligent historians often had to rely on secondary accounts, rumors, or cryptic references in other manuscripts to piece together fragments of the truth. The secrets of the archives reveal the careful balance of preservation and control. Knowledge of the flawed creator was not destroyed, but carefully stored, protected by layers of authority and silence. Within these stone vaults, human understanding of creation survived, hidden yet enduring, waiting for the moment when it could be fully recognized. The Demiurge persisted in maps, diagrams, and texts, a presence both erased and preserved. These archives remind us that history is not only what is visible, but also what is concealed. That the past is a landscape shaped by those who control access to knowledge, and that the imperfect creator still casts a quiet shadow over the world we inhabit. Even after centuries of suppression, censorship, and careful rewriting, the Demiurge persists. By the year 2025, the figure remains alive, not in official texts or mainstream teachings, but in myths, art, and hidden knowledge that have quietly survived the scrutiny of power. From secret manuscripts to allegorical stories, from subtle symbols in architecture to inspiration in creative expression, the flawed creator leaves traces that challenge the way humanity understands itself and the world. The Demiurge reminds us that imperfection is not only inherent in the material realm, but also mirrored in human thought, action, and creation. Artists continue to capture duality and imperfection in their work, reflecting the subtle influence of the Demiurge. Paintings of human form reveal asymmetry, sketches of the cosmos hint at anomalies, and literature explores moral complexity, rather than simple goodness or evil. Scholars studying these works notice patterns that echo the hidden knowledge preserved by mystics and secret societies for centuries. The imperfect creator is visible not in overt narrative, but in the interplay of flaw and brilliance. A reminder that understanding reality requires observation beyond surface appearances. Modern researchers exploring archives, monastic libraries, and private collections uncover diagrams, notes, and texts that suggest a world shaped by imperfection. Celestial charts that do not match orthodox predictions, anatomical sketches that explore irregularities, and philosophical writings questioning divine perfection all hint at the Demiurge's presence. These discoveries are not widely publicized because they challenge long-held beliefs and contradict simplified narratives of flawless creation. Yet, for those willing to look, the evidence persists, scattered across centuries and continents, a hidden thread connecting humanity to its complex origin. The Demiurge also survives in the imagination of thinkers, conspiracists, and independent scholars who refuse to accept sanitized history. By questioning what has been erased, censored, or misrepresented, they reveal the importance of acknowledging imperfection as a fundamental aspect of reality. The figure becomes a mirror, reflecting humanity's own errors, limitations, and moments of unexpected insight. To study the Demiurge is to study both the world and ourselves, recognizing that brilliance and flaw coexist in every human endeavor, every creation, and every idea. ultimately, the Demiurge challenges us to see without illusion, to confront the imperfections of existence honestly. By embracing the notion that creation itself is flawed, humanity gains a deeper understanding of resilience, ingenuity, and responsibility. The myths, the art, the hidden knowledge all serve as reminders that truth is rarely simple and often obscured, yet it endures for those willing to seek it. The Demiurge is not a figure to be canonized, celebrated, or fully explained. Instead, it is a presence that invites reflection, a constant reminder that understanding reality requires looking beyond dogma, beyond perfection, and beyond the stories carefully curated by those who once sought to control what humanity could know.